Have you ever wondered how we got where we are today? Well, it could have been a lot different. We could have been Massachusetts or Virginians or Connecticuters, whatever they call themselves, or even Pennsylvanians. Yeah, you know, there was a royal mess that the British left us in or put us in the greater Western New York region. That's what we're going to be talking about in this week's edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report, which, as always, is brought to you
Each
by...
week, our community makes history. Each week, you make history. And each week, there's only one source to turn to for the first take on history. You know what that is? Subscribe to the Sentinel right now to discover the history being made in your own backyard. The Mendon Honeoye Falls Lima Sentinel. More than just your news, it's your history. Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report. Join us each episode as we discuss fantastic topics ranging from history to science to the strange and the wonderful, as well as the treasured spirit with which our region has infused America. We challenge you to consider all things Greater Western New York, from our region's very beginnings to how it inspires, how it empowers, and why it is so admired. Here's the host of the State of Greater Western New York Report, Chris Carosa.
Hi there, and welcome everyone again to the State of Greater Western New York Report. We're going to be talking about how we got to be New York rather than some other state. That's right, prior to the Revolutionary War, we had a lot of different competing interests in who would lay claim to this, and this is just on the British side. So let's get right into it and start this week's episode, which I label episode 6 because it's part of another series, but we'll call it A Royal Mess. So, what did it start as? What happened to really get this thing kicked off? You know, thanks to the flippancy of English royalty, or maybe even their failure to attend geography classes, the Greater Western New York region was given not one, not two, not even three different colonies. In fact, it had been promised to no fewer than 5 different colonies. Here's how it happened. While Christopher Columbus represented Spain in his discovery of America, the explorers of the Spanish kingdom preferred to focus on the southern portion of North America and compete with the Portuguese for control of essentially South and Central America, well, South America for the Portuguese. The French, on the other hand, they were the first Europeans to venture into our neck of the woods, although they admittedly were more interested in trying to locate a passage to the Pacific Ocean rather than to earnestly concentrate on sustainable settlements. Now, the French failed to find this navigable route, the Northwest Passage, but they did stumble upon the economic benefits of fur trade. And thanks to their friend relations with those who had experience hunting that fur, they were able to really show that there's economic power to be had in the North American continent. Now, you know, unlike their European competitors, the British relied on private enterprise to colonize the New World, especially after the misadventures of Sir Walter Raleigh. Now, here's what they did. So the king didn't mean that he wasn't pleased with the fact that private enterprise would go in there. And the fact that King, who ultimately granted these private companies their land rights, had a vested interest in this. Of course, sometimes one king forgot what the earlier king had done, and sometimes that same king forgot what he himself had done earlier. So here's a rough chronology of this bowl of land title spaghetti created by the British monarchy. Sometimes, well, actually, before we start, maybe what we should say is this. Bear in mind, the Greater Western New York region, it's roughly between the 42nd and just above the 43rd lines of latitude. So keep that in mind, because some of these things we'll be talking about lines of latitude. So the first wave of English settled in the early 1600s. On April 10th, 1606, James I granted the Virginia Company rights to colonies along the Atlantic coast. This is called the First Charter of Virginia, or the Charter of 1606. The king didn't invest a dime in this private venture, but he demanded 20% of all earnings. Now, to help juice these profits, King James split the company into two competing divisions. The London Company controlled what's called the First Colony, from the 34th to the 41st parallel. That's that red area that you see. The Plymouth Company held all the lands between the 38th and 45th parallels, the green part. This is called the Second Colony. So they weren't really called the London Colony or the Plymouth Colony in the actual charter. They were called the First Colony and the Second Colony. But the companies that ran them were known by those names, the London Company and the Plymouth Company. You see this yellow part, this overlap part between the 38th and the 41st parallels? They could be settled by either company. But the stipulation was that either company could not settle within 100 miles of the other. So it's kind of like that game Civilization. You can't create a city too close to another city. So King James did that because he wanted them to make money and he wanted to give them an incentive to colonize this region. Well, I guess the Virginia Company or the London Company really impressed King James, because just a few years later, on March 23rd, 1609, the charter extended the rights of the London Company from sea to sea. And you see this diagonal across the boundary here. This is the sort of like the northeastern boundary of the land. This bisects the greater Western New York region. So in effect, we are part of Virginia. Well, wait a second here. In 1620, November 3rd, for those keeping score at home, James I decided to grant the Charter of New England. So this is a separate and new charter for the successor of the Plymouth Company, and it gave them all land rights from the 40-degree mark of northern latitude to the 48-degree mark. So that's that green line. And you see what's going on here? We have this red diagonal and this whole swath of green line from sea to shining sea overlapping. So part of greater Western New York is now owned by both Virginia and New England. And the other half is just owned by New England. So I guess there's no question there. So what happened next? Well, what happened next was that a new king, Charles I, he established the Charter of Massachusetts Bay on March 4th, 1628. This replaced the Council of New England's charter, and the new charter defined the southern border of Massachusetts as between the 3 English miles of the south part of the said Charles River, that's actually what it said, and the 3 English miles to the northward of the said river called Monomac, alias Merrimack, and we call it Merrimack now. So that put the southern border at roughly 42 degrees and 2 minutes, I think that's what it is, north latitude. And the northern border, well, that's somewhere up in Maine, because that Merrimack River, it actually went farther north than what they thought. So Massachusetts could claim way up there into Maine. So it's the southern border, though, that we are more interested in. This time, if there was any doubt about what James meant by sea to sea, Charles specified the grant extended from the Atlantic and the Western Sea. So now what that means is essentially, you look at the blue lines here, we're Massachusetts. The greater Western New York region is Massachusetts. But not so fast. In 1662, Charles II decided to create a new colony by issuing the Connecticut Charter on April 23rd. The king declared Connecticut's border to be, and again I quote, on the north by the line of the Massachusetts plantation to the South Sea of the west part. That South Sea basically is the Pacific Ocean. Because of the murkiness of this Massachusetts southern border, remember, we warned you that this would get interesting, Connecticut could claim a sliver of the greater Western New York region slicing through the bottom of the southern tier. Now, if you're like me, you're probably losing track. Are we Connecticut? Are we Massachusetts? Or are we both Connecticut and Massachusetts? And when does New York even enter the picture? Well, We'll get to that in a moment. But first, we'll want to give you this word from our sponsor.
Through the mists of time, nature and man have both created and buried treasures beyond the imagination. With the ages, these riches slowly dissolve into mere myths until they are forever forgotten. But there are those brave souls who tirelessly cling to the truth, ever seeking to discover the undiscovered, to reveal what has always been there, to uncover the hidden gems of a land thought forsaken but loved by millions. 50 Hidden Gems of Greater Western New York. Discover the secrets in your own backyard. Buy your copy now at 50hiddengems.com.
Welcome back to the State of Greater Western New York report. I'm Chris Carosa, and we are talking about the royal mess that the British monarchy really left our region through and past the Revolutionary War, as we'll get to in a second. But I want to get you caught up to speed to where we left off, because we're introducing sort of like a third party into this whole British kind of spaghetti code, I guess you can call it. And that's, remember the year that we're talking about here. The year is 1664. And at that time, we have King Charles creating a new colony called Connecticut. And Connecticut and Massachusetts kind of ran parallel from sea to shining sea to sea, as they say, or the westerns, the South Sea. Even though it was west, they called it the South Sea. I don't know. I don't get it. They, like I said, these guys were confused geographically, and really, it's just going to get a whole lot worse. But first, let's get into some geopolitical concerns. Now, you see here, this is our map where we left off, and you can see that Connecticut is going all the way across that southern edge of New York, what is now New York State, and in northern, what is now Pennsylvania, through Ohio. And by the way, you know, if you've ever heard of the Connecticut Reserve or the Western Reserve in Ohio, that's that section in Ohio here where Connecticut laid claim to. This is even after Pennsylvania became a state, because Ohio wasn't a state at that point. So Connecticut laid claim to it. And as we'll see in a second, Connecticut tended to be aggressive with its claims, because it was only a sliver of Western New York. I guess it really didn't care about that. But we're not talking about the British at this point. We're going to talk about another empire from the continent of Europe, and that would be the Dutch. And you see what Connecticut is doing. Connecticut is going through, and portions of Massachusetts are going through what is New Netherland. This is owned by the Dutch. They have colonies there. They're actively trading. They are making lots of money. And the British just basically say, no, that's our land. Well, what? What's the justification? It's just our land. And the Dutch were traders primarily. They really weren't settlers. I mean, they had communities. They had a pretty big system on how to do this. It was quite elaborate, and eventually the English would kind of adopt it, at least the ones in New York. But right now, the Dutch own this part up through what's now New York City, then New Amsterdam, up through the Hudson Valley, all the way to what's now Albany, which was then Fort Orange. So Charles told his brother, the Duke of York, hey, you know what? You can have that if you want it. Just, I'll give you the authority to put together a little army or navy and sail some ships over there and just kick them out. So he did. You know, James sailed the ships over there, and went up to the harbor of New York, and Peter Stuyvesant said, let's see, let me do the math here. I guess if you're into the financial aspects of things like the Dutch were, you were pretty good at math. And so Stuyvesant looked out and counted the number of ships and counted what he had, and he said, okay, yeah, come on in, guys, you can have it. Just let us keep doing our business. And the British did. So, what did we have going on next? Well, next we have Charles II giving his brother James, and by the way, completely forgetting what he had done 2 years earlier, he gave his brother James the 1664 grants to a royal patent that, in essence, created what would become the New York province of New York or New York Colony. Now, what was James? James was the Duke of York. So you get it? Duke of York, New York. That's how we got our name. And New Amsterdam became New York, Port Orange became Albany, and this was in 1664. So it's just 2 years after he gave Connecticut the land that he'd given him. Now, you might remember that this Duke of York, Charles II, brothers James, he would ultimately become King James II. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. So the royal patent that gave James part of the lands previously deeded to Massachusetts and Connecticut, in addition, it included lands that were then claimed by New Hampshire, but that's really a Vermont thing, not a greater Western New York thing. So, can this get any more confusing? Well, you know the answer to that. It could and it will. In fact, it gets immediately confusing. So in 1664, the Dutch give the New Netherlands to the British, but then a few years later, Britain and the Dutch get in a war in Europe, and the Dutch take over New Netherlands again. And this happened 2 or 3 times, back and forth. So finally, it ended up being New York, and that's where we are today. And it's still, we got rid of the Dutch, finally, but New York still has to contend with its neighboring colonies who have claims on it, Connecticut and Massachusetts. Again, we'll ignore the New Hampshire thing. That's a different subject. But it does get worse. It does get more confusing. And that's because on February 28th, 1681, the Crown, again, it's the geographically confused Charles II, granted William Penn, and that's the name for whom we get the name Pennsylvania. Well, actually, it was named after his father, but he was the model for the Quaker Oaks little box there. No kidding. I think that's true. But anyways, so Charles II gave William Penn the land rights up through the 43rd parallel. Now, remember what I said about how we define the greater Western New York region. If we look at it, the 43rd parallel, it runs just south of Syracuse, north of Waterloo and Geneva, and clips the southern half of Monroe County. It also slices through Batavia and bisects Buffalo and Niagara Falls. In essence, what this does is it spares Mr. Penn from dealing with the vagaries of lake effect snow from Lake Ontario. So I'm sure he didn't even care. He never really, the odd thing about it is the Quakers and William Penn were friends with the Delaware and Lenape Indians. They were down actually next to Delaware, New Jersey, and in that part of Pennsylvania, and they made deals with them to settle the land. In fact, the Delaware and Lenape wanted the Quakers to settle the land. They never really made any deals with the Iroquois Confederacy, who owned that area which they lay claim to in the greater Western New York region, and even beyond, east of it too. In fact, if you look at the map of their claim, you'll see that it does cover that entire swath where the Iroquois Confederacy at that point was controlling. Remember, at this time, this is just about the time when the Iroquois Confederacy knocks out the Erie. So there's no other Indians in Greater Western New York except for those in the Iroquois Confederacy, primarily the Seneca, maybe a little bit of the Cayuga. And ironically, again, it was the Onondaga that's primarily responsible for knocking out the Erie, the last tribe that was here. But in either case, Pennsylvania really didn't have anything to do with what was going on in the greater Western New York region. They just laid claim to the region. Now, what I should add is this, sort of like a parenthetical thing. You see on this map here how Connecticut still claims the northern part of Pennsylvania. And again, this wasn't resolved until after the Revolutionary War. Well, there were actually conflicts, armed conflicts, in northeastern Pennsylvania between the Connecticut Yankees and those settlers from Pennsylvania. This is kind of odd if you think about it. Quakers are known for being nonviolent. They ended up getting in wars with the Connecticut Yankees, and they ended up getting in wars with, after William Penn died, with the Delaware and the Lenape Indians. So, I don't know about this we're nonviolent sort of thing. Anyways, this war between the Pennsylvanians and the Connecticutans, is that a word? That it went through several iterations, twice before the Revolutionary War, and then once again after the Revolutionary War. But because it was kind of straddling the Revolutionary War, it actually had an impact on the war, and it also ended up having an impact on the greater Western New York region. We'll get into that story in another episode, but remember those wars and remember what's going on here. There's multiple claims to the same land, and they're legitimate claims. Each of these colonies or provinces have been granted charters, and the charters were not very well written. So that's why you had this overlap in all these lands. Now, if you want to just kind of see how bad things are getting, it would just in the Northeast in Pennsylvania, you have, well, for Western New York, at one time or another, we had 5 colonies. You could count them. And at any time, 4 of them held competing claims. That means at the same time. So essentially, Virginia, even though it was technically the owner of a portion of the greater Western New York, it was an owner in the same way the Spanish owned this part of North America. Yeah, technically they laid claim to it, but they really didn't do anything. And they weren't even actively pursuing it. So they gave it up pretty easily. Now, they didn't give everything up, because if you expanded this map more, you'd see that they'd have claims outside into the Northwest territories. But as did New York, by the way. If you can imagine what New York looked like prior to the Revolutionary War, the grant to the Duke of York, to James, Charles II's brother James, it really went up into Ontario and all the way over to Lake Huron and into Michigan. So that's how much New York had claimed. Now, after the Revolutionary War, they couldn't claim Canada anymore, but New York did actually claim parts of Michigan and west of that. But that was short-lived. Again, they couldn't send people there to settle it, so it was really just a claim only. But these claims now, just immediately after the Revolutionary War, they had to be resolved. And all of them did, not just the ones in Western New York, but the Connecticut one, even Vermont. I mean, Vermont was still part of New York colony, but it seceded during the Revolutionary War to become its own independent republic. That's why there were only 13 original colonies that became states, not a 14th state of Vermont. That didn't happen until a little later, after things were settled, after it was clear that New York would no longer claim that portion. So remember, New Hampshire also claimed that portion. So it was a fight between the two states for what was in essence an independent republic. It was by the Revolutionary War, Connecticut and Pennsylvania withdrew any pretensions for our beloved homeland, if you want to call it that. So it was really down to just 2. it was between New York and Massachusetts. Both had legitimate, albeit awkward, rights to our region. And this conflict, it never was an armed conflict. So conflict might be too harsh of a word. But this disagreement was finally settled with the Treaty of Hartford in December 1786. In fact, the date is December 16th, 1786, which is also called the birthday of the Greater Western New York region. Now, there's, again, we can get into the details of this later, but there's some question if this was done within the strict guidelines of the Articles of Confederation. Many say that, it's worth questioning, but it doesn't matter. It's a done deal now. Essentially what happened is that delegates from New York and Massachusetts went outside of the federal jurisdiction of things and negotiated with themselves in neutral territory. That's why they were in Hartford, Connecticut. And they came up with this agreement on how to divide New York. And they did so by creating this line, a boundary line, running from the 82nd Millstone on the New York-Pennsylvania border straight up to North Ontario. And this boundary line would become known as preemption line because while New York would govern everything west of that line, they'd govern it from a political standpoint, Massachusetts held the economic rights or the preemptive right to buy the land from the Seneca and then resell it. And it did resell it. In fact, it resold it twice. But again, that's another story. So there's a lot of other stories that come out of this. Just where we're ending right now today, is we're ending at the point that New York and Massachusetts both claim this portion of the New York, what ends up being New York State, in which is the Greater Western New York region. So we will get into that at some point again in the future. So let's go back to our screen here and make sure that we're all set, that we answered any questions. So yes, there was a there. All right, yeah, we'll get into how Pennsylvania sold that land twice. There was an economic issue that went on, and it really had to do with how much it was really down to this. So Pennsylvania lent out or sold this thing via a bond or like a mortgage, and there was rampant inflation, and the buyers of this mortgage expected to pay back in current dollars, but Massachusetts tied it to gold, and the gold was just way more expensive than the real dollars were at that time. So they essentially just foreclosed on the deal. But we'll get into that more specifically later. For now, what I want to just say is we'll leave it off at this. We had multiple colonies claiming the Greater Western New York region. By the end of the Revolutionary War, it comes down to two, Massachusetts and New York. We all know who wins out in the end, but it might be interesting to find out how they win out. Again, thank you for watching today's show. If you would like to ask questions like the audience does, feel free to go to stateof.greaterwesternnewyork.com. You can register for free, and every Thursday you'll be sent an invitation to the link that would allow you to be a live audience. And what's the advantage of being in the live audience? Well, that means that you can ask questions of the guest, in which case this week I'm the guest, I guess. Well, you can ask questions live and you'll get answers, hopefully. Otherwise, if you can't watch it live, and I realize noontime during work days are tough to watch, you could always catch a rebroadcast on our site, stateof.greaterwesternnewyork.com. Just go there, the archives, and look up the thing. Or if you like our Facebook page, or if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, then you'll be notified when this show is rebroadcast every Sunday at 1:30. So you'll be able to watch it there too. Well, that's all we have for today. I want to thank you all for watching, and we hope to see you again next week. Bye-bye for now.